Cold water worked the edge of the desert like a patient file, dragging fog inland and laying it against the lighthouse stones. I woke to the low hiss the upwelling teaches and shrugged into the oilskin coat that keeps truth off the bones until the work begins. Routine first. I checked the lantern room by touch, glass cool as a kept promise, prisms clean, wick trimmed to a neat crescent that pleases the lens. The handlamp took a slow breath and showed me my own breath in return. I like simple exchanges. They keep a person honest in a house built to be louder than a storm. On the gallery, I felt the rail for salt and found grit where the wind had made a new habit overnight. The sea ran iron and green under the weather, seals sounding like tired saws on the outer bar. Wreck timbers leaned in the near shallows, their nails like teeth the surf refused to swallow. I took the log slate from its hook and wrote the morning plain. Cold, upwelling present, visibility ragged, swell low, gulls working bait far inside where they should not find it. A smell rode the fog that did not belong to this regime, warmer and sweet, as if a tide from another place had been poured into ours. The bell likes its hours. A keeper learns the rope as he learns his own mind. By the marks a hand understands better than numbers. I ran the bell rope through my fingers, checked the splice, looked at the sand anchors holding the tower's windward guy, then gave the bell a trial call, the kind that says the house is awake and the day has been counted. The bronze answered clean, a steady workmanlike tone that traveled out and met the hush without apology. I waited for the usual echo off the cliff teeth to the north and traced what came instead. The reply was late, not long, but wrong. I felt it before I allowed myself to name it, a second bell that did not match the first, arriving as if the dunes had taken notes and needed a breath to translate them back. It had a husk to it, a dry aftertaste like rope rubbed in dust. I opened the handlamp and closed it again to give thought a boundary. The cliffs could play tricks, I told myself. Wind can invert the order of things. The desert plays at sea only when it is bored. I rang again, measured not by seconds, but by a keeper's old habit of counting the length of a steady breath. The tower answered true, and then, later than comfort, came the sands version, thinner, a little strained, traveling not from stone or wave, but from behind, from inland, as if a buried bell had been woken by mine and needed time to remember how to speak. I set the rope down, palms buzzing the way hands buzz after a long drive over corrugations, and let the feeling fade before I wrote anything more on the slate. Inside, the watchroom smelled of old lamp smoke and wool. I wiped the slate clean and started again, because a line written in anxiety is not a line you want to see later when the sea is lifting at the door. I wrote that the bell tone carried. I wrote that echoes shift in fog. I didn't write about the sand because I do not make entries I cannot stand behind. A keeper owes the next keeper a ledger free of boasting and ghosts. Still, I left a space on the slate as if a word were on its way, and I had not learned it yet. I took the handlamp and walked the path to the lee dune where the sand anchors lie in a shallow with more shell than should be here. My boots made a sound that was neither crunch nor hiss, a padded rasp like fingers on parchment. I stopped at the upwind anchor and checked the set. The shackle wore a fresh shine on one side, as if the line had been persuaded to a new angle during the night without a wind strong enough to argue that change. Something had leaned. The dune face ahead showed faint slumps, not the clean slides of a gust, but careful bows, as if weight had moved down slope in slow thought. I knelt and pressed my ear to the sand where the anchor bit. The ground held a cool hum that did not rise to the skin so much as inform the bones. It had rhythm in it, not a steady metronome, but a sequence with a gap where a person expects certainty. I stood quickly, because a man kneeling to hear the desert is a man who can forget time, and a keeper is paid to remember it even when no clocks are present. I tugged the anchor, found it sound, and looked back at my own tracks. They were fine until the place where I had paused to watch the gulls. Beyond that pause, the stride changed to a narrower set as if I had walked with my knees close to avoid spilling something balanced high. I had not. The toes pointed a shade more seaward than I favor. The left heel cut deeper on the turn. It was my boot, my habit, but not my mood. I followed the line back to the gallery and felt watched without malice, the way a person feels when a well keeps the voices of those who work around it and repeats them back later for its own amusement. The radio coughed on the desk, a polite throat clear, and the station farther down the coast asked about the fog line and the seal raft near the rusted hull we all use as a landmark even though we call it by different names. I pressed the key and kept it simple. Low visibility, quiet swell, no hazard to navigation beyond the usual. I did not mention the bell's twin behind the dunes. There is a difference between operational truth and the kind of truth that makes another operator quiet on the line. By midday, the sun tried and failed to pry a brightness into the fog sheet. The upwelling held the air against the ground like cold cloth. I turned the bell again for a maintenance call and counted by breaths held at the top of the chest. The late reply came as expected now that I anticipated it, a whisper worn into tone, a copy that had traveled through dry thickness before reaching me. Along the base of the dune, a line of insect tracks rode small zigzags until they broke in a place where no wind had scuffed them. A beetle does not forget its own arithmetic without help. I wrote on the slate at last, a compromise with myself. Echo irregular, investigate origin inland, no impact to mariner safety. Then, under that, a keeper's aside that is allowed if it stays brief. Bell answered by sand after a pause that felt like thought. I underlined nothing. I never underline. Paper should not carry a heartbeat. When the light began to ask for its evening duties, I climbed with the handlamp and let the old steps test my legs. In the lantern room, I felt a soft push against my back the way air shifts when a door opens in another part of a house, but no door here was open. The prisms threw faint patterns on the brass as if the lens were deciding whether to join an argument I could not hear. I set the burner, checked the vents, and made ready in the order the service taught, because order is the only rope that never rots. I went out once more to the gallery and looked at the waste of sand where the desert leans toward the shore and the wrecks pretend to be part of the living chart. The fog took shapes and lost them. I wanted to ring the bell again to test the pattern until I had the measure of it, but appetite is a poor master in a place whose work is to outlast appetite. I held the rope only long enough for the fibers to learn my intention, then let it fall slack. When I turned to go, a faint dull thump reached me from inland, then a second, the kind of sound a buried thing makes when it tries the top of its box. Night would put changes in the order of response. The desert cools and stiffens, sound travels differently, seals come in and bark in a register that breaks neat observations into guesses. I set the routine before the dark could tell me what it wanted. Lamp on by rule, bell by schedule, rounds clockwise, log slate on the desk with space left for what does not fit a line. If the sand chose to answer late, I would be at the panel to hear it. If it chose not to answer at all, I would still have the light. The desert does not hurry, but it keeps its appointments. That is what I told myself as the first faint sweep laid a pale stripe on the fog and held it there like a ruler laid along a child's page. Below, where the anchors hold and the dune bows to the wind that was not blowing, something shifted once, cautious and helpful, as if the ground itself were agreeing to keep the tower steady for the night, in exchange for the bell being rung on time. I went down to check the guys anyway. A bargain is better if both sides honor it. When I stepped back inside the watchroom, the hand lamp on the table showed a ring of sand as delicate as a tide mark around its base that had not been there when I set it down. It looked like the lamp had been lifted and replaced by a careful hand that didn't wish to be seen. I dusted it away with the cuff of the oilskin and didn't write it. A man can only carry so much into a ledger before the ledger refuses to carry him in return. I put my palm flat on the slate and felt cool through the stone, a patient cool that waits longer than men do. I took the bell rope and gave a single pull, not enough to fill the bay with duty, just enough to say the house was awake to its edges. The tower spoke. I waited. Somewhere inland, a sand-thick twin began to answer, late, and I felt the dune breathe. I did not look toward it. I stood with the rope in my hand and let the pattern find me instead. Routine would take me through the night, or it would not. Either way, I would keep the light turning. The fog kept its patient hand on the tower through the morning watch, and the cold line of water along the shoals sharpened into a darker seam. I moved through the rounds without skipping, letting habit set the pace so my mind would not run ahead of my work. Glass first, vent second, burner by the quiet order that keeps flame from sulking. The hand lamp gave steady light. On the desk, the log slate waited, a clean field that prefers evidence to feelings. I wrote a brief note about the gull raft and erased it again. A keeper does not crowd his own record when the sea is trying to speak. I stood at the bell rope and listened with my hands before I asked the bronze to talk. Fiber has a way of storing a story if you let it, the same way a reef stores the shape of storms. The splice felt true, the lay even, the coat dry where it should be dry. I gave the bell a measured pull and held my breath to make room for what might follow. The tone rolled outward, workmanlike, a sound that belongs to duty and not to drama. I waited in the fog until my chest asked for air and let it have some. The reply came late again, a thin cousin stepping shyly into a doorway, the sand's throat clearing after the tower had finished speaking. I tried to trace a direction with my ear, a keeper's trick no chart teaches. The echo refused to sit on any single point. It seemed to come from the lee dune, and then from behind the wreck timbers, and then from inside the old saltgrass hollow where the wind used to lie down before the anchors pinned the guy lines in place. I told myself that fog builds false rooms and opens false doors. Still, I tied a small hitch in the rope at the mark I use for maintenance calls, not for signal, and left it there to remind me that the house had developed a habit I did not yet earn the right to write as fact. By mid-morning, the radio lifted again. The station to the south asked if I had seen the bait line shift and whether any calves were hauled out on the inner bar, where they sometimes rest when the water runs iron. I gave the answer expected and paused on the key, then added that the fog carried a sweetness I did not like. The other keeper said a warm current can push a scent across a day without showing itself. He meant it kindly. We rang off with the usual promise to check again toward evening, because we pretend we can schedule the sea. I put on the oilskin and went down to the anchors. Sand has its own clock. If you put your fingers into it at the right time of morning, you can feel the night's cooling still lingering below the skin. I palmed the upwind shackle and felt that same cool hum I had found before, not stronger, just more certain of itself, as if the dune had been practicing. The guy line sat easy, but the angle was not the angle I favor. It tilted a breath toward the wreck field, as though some careful hand had urged it that way to improve a sightline I do not use. I set my boot against the anchor, leaned back, and brought the line true. The dune face held its bow and did not release another grain. When I stepped away, the sand remembered my boot, even after I scraped the mark smooth. In the shallow, a crab track stitched itself neatly until it reached the faint circle I had cleaned around the anchor. There it stopped, not with the confused spirals that say an animal lost its argument with smell, but with a neat pause and a deliberate retreat. I bent and smelled the sand. It carried the cold mineral of the upwelling, and under that, the same off note I had read in the fog, like a rope coiled after being hauled over strange wood. I took the handlamp inland, keeping the lighthouse at my back so the tower could write a straight line along the fog behind me. The path over the lee crest felt longer than it should. A small trick of scale, I told myself. A man measures by muscle when the air hides the horizon. Still, when I came over the crown and looked down into the bowl behind the dune, the place where the wind lays its sleep during hard weather, the shape of the hollow seemed wrong by one quiet degree. The far lip had shifted, not a slide, a decision, as if the bowl had been asked to tilt its ear toward the tower. I spoke aloud, the way a keeper will when he wishes to hear his own voice go out and come back proof that the world still returns what is sent. My words came back sifted, pulled through grit like bread through a clean cloth. I did not like it. I marked the lip with a little cairn of shell and a short stick, not a signal to anyone but myself, and returned by a slightly different line to see whether my own tracks would remember me. They did until they did not. In a stretch where the sand should have taken the print plainly, the pattern thinned and blurred into something that looked like my boot when I'm tired after a climb. I had not climbed. My legs were fresh. The dune offered a correction to a walk I had not taken. I wrote on the slate because a thought grows large when it is denied paper. Echo persistent, source uncertain, anchors steady, minor spatial drift inland. Monitor. Under that, I copied a fragment of a keeper's manual from memory, something about how a signalman must never allow a mystery to set the schedule. It helped to see the words, even out of place, even in a hand that was mine and also not mine when I looked at it in the low light. The letters leant to the right a hair more than I like. I flexed my fingers and tried again until the hand settled back into itself. Near noon, a break came in the fog, only a window, and through it, the wreck field showed like old ribs. A seal lifted its head between the timbers and then sank, leaving a trail on the surface that bent away from the usual set. The sound that followed was not the bark that makes a person smile despite himself. It was a coughing, the kind a horn makes when salt sits in a place not meant for salt. The bell rope twitched against my wrist, though I was not near it. I looked down and saw a smear of damp on the fiber where a hand would have held, but the air around it was dry. I decided on a simple test. I would ring on the maintenance hitch, then walk inland with the hand lamp, counting the breaths between tower and reply by the shrinking of the light when I placed a thumb over the lens each time the bronze spoke. Not numbers, just pacing that a body can keep. I pulled the rope. The bell gave its honest word. I turned and walked, thumb to glass, slow and even, letting the light dim and rise with each breath. The late answer came in its place, thinner, pulled through grain. I kept walking until the reply no longer felt like a stranger standing at my back, but like a voice nearly beside me. At the edge of the lee bowl, where I had set the shell marker, the reply tipped from thin to full, as if I had stepped into a room where the walls knew the bell better than I did. The handlamp guttered once and settled. A small thread of sand fell down the far lip and drew a line toward my boot. I moved the lamp aside. The line drifted until it reached the circle of my light and then stopped, forming a shallow crescent like a listening ear. I am not a man to talk to dunes. I said nothing. I stood with the lamp and let time pass until my mouth went dry. Then I backed out of the bowl, the way a person leaves a tide pool he does not want to cloud with careless steps. Back at the tower, the bell rope felt warmer than the room, as if someone had just taken a turn on it and left a little heat behind. I checked the clockwork on the lamp, though I knew the gears were sound. The vents ticked softly in the hush. On the slate, I wrote the only line I could defend. Inland basin resonates, local acoustics unknown, no hazard to navigation at present. I signed in a tight hand and wiped the margin where I had almost written more. As evening crawled in, the fog thickened again, rebuilt in heavier cloth by the cold water that likes this coast better than living creatures do. I walked the guys one more time and found each steady. The anchors did not complain. The dune's lip held the shallow arc it had chosen. I let the bell speak by schedule and kept still after each tone, waiting for the inland reply with my hands open at my sides so the rope would not tell me anything by accident. The answer came as before, late and dry, and finished with a faint rustle like a rope being laid carefully back onto a pin. I understood the shape of the problem, but not its center. The sand was answering in a voice borrowed from my own bell, and the interval between us was not a distance the chart could measure. It was some other measure, like the time it takes doubt to cross a room. I could work with that. I could build a plan from breath and rope and the patient habits of a house that prefers order. I could also feel the cost settling in. A night spent listening for a sound I could not explain. A ledger that would hold my care without forgiving it. A bargain with a desert that seems to want the light to keep turning. I set the lamp for the night and checked the bearings as if a visitor might arrive. No visitor did. The only footsteps belonged to the keeper who had already walked, and to the faint will of sand deciding whether to keep his print or return it. When I took up the bell rope for the last call before full dark, I found a small ridge of grit under my palm where the fiber had been pressed against the desk edge in a way I do not leave it. I cleared it with my thumb, breathed, and rang. The bell spoke. Far inland, after a pause that felt almost polite, the dune replied. The morning came thin and gray, the kind that keeps a man from believing in edges. I let the house set my pace because the mind will slip if left to choose. The lamp took to its chores without sulking. The prisms wore the damp lightly. I checked the vents and felt the faint tick of cooling where warm air likes to rest. The watchroom smelled of old wool and last night's smoke. I wrote the sea first because the sea does not wait its turn when it has something to say. Cold line intact, bait pushed oddly inshore, raft scattered and reformed as if a hand were experimenting with a schoolchild's abacus. I erased the last phrase and put down plainer words. The slate forgives plainness. Before I touched the bell rope, I held it a moment to listen with my palms. Fiber can teach, but you must meet it halfway. It felt rested and faintly warm, as though a hand had left recently that was not mine. I didn't write that. I gave the bronze a workman pull, the kind made for mariners, not for moods, and held still. The tower spoke its honest sound into the fog. I waited until the chest asked for air. The inland answer came with its usual small delay, dry and paired, a note that had crossed sand and arrived with grit in it. I tried to feel annoyance the way one puts on a coat, but what arrived was closer to respect. A voice should not be ignored just because it is late. I made a plan that did not require faith. I would set a simple figure in the world and see whether the dune wished to join it. The handlamp can mark a line if you are patient. I walked from the tower toward the lee bowl, stopping at even breaths to place the lamp on the ground for a countable pause, and then lift it again. No written counts, only the body's quiet arithmetic, the way a person measures a hill by how the legs begin to complain. At each stop, I spoke the same short phrase a signalman might send when testing a deadline: "Station awake, reply if able." The fog took the words and salted their edges. The dune did not answer with speech. It answered with the late bell, as if that were the only language it cared to learn. At the rim of the bowl, my light picked out the shell cairn I had set. The arc of the lip had changed again by a shy degree. The far side held higher, not slumped, just willful. Inside the bowl, the sand lay combed in long strokes that matched no wind. I knelt and pressed 2 fingers into it. Cool lay just beneath the skin, and under that cool a hum I recognized the way a mechanic recognizes a bearing going a little off. I stood before the hum could declare itself my business. A keeper cannot go to ground every time the earth remembers its own music. I spoke across the hollow, the same phrase as before, and waited. No voice returned. The bell behind me gave its late reply, but the bowl sent nothing except a soft sliding of grains near my left boot, a slip without a cause. A small beetle wrote a wavering script toward the mark, and then turned back with a certainty that made me uncomfortable. I moved the lamp and the beetle chose a different path that still avoided the center, as though the light had a weight I could not feel. I walked the slope where the guys crest the dune and checked each anchor in turn. The shackles sat right, no sand packed where it should not be. On the windward anchor, a new shine showed on the pin, thin and precise, like the result of patient twisting by a helper who wanted to stay just this side of mischief. I set my boot and returned it to the angle I trust. The line hummed in my palm, faint as breath against glass. When I let go, it held true. The dune kept its bow. Back at the watchroom, the radio gave a small throat clear and brought the southern keeper's voice with it. He spoke of a dead calm that was not calm, a quiet that behaved like work being done out of sight. He asked if my bell was steady. I said it was. He asked if the desert had barged into our sea again with dust. I said the air tasted sweet in a way I did not like. He chuckled in the manner of men who know the cost of speaking plainly over air. We signed off with the usual promise. I added neither comfort nor complaint. Then I wrote on the slate that inland resonance persisted, and that routine remained effective. The line felt like a gift I was offering to my own nerves. Toward midday, a pocket of clearer air slid past the tower and gave me a slice of distance. The wrecks appeared and vanished as if the sea were practicing shuffles. I tried a trick learned from an old signalman who retired inland and thereafter missed only the parts of the coast that refused to behave. I rang the bell softly, not a call to mariners, only a house test, and walked a short arc around the base of the tower. At each step, I lifted the hand lamp to shoulder height, closed my eyes, and felt for the moment when the inland answer grew a shaving louder. It happened on the side of the tower that faces the lee bowl, as if a wire had been stretched through the stone and tuned to a pitch I could not hear until the bell plucked it. I do not discuss wires with sand. Instead, I tested the house itself, a sensible thing in any weather. In the lantern room, I checked the vents and found one a touch reluctant, a hinge with new grit in it. The grit was not the fine dust the wind brings. It was a little coarser, like the back of a sealskin after time in the sun. I wiped it away and set a dab of oil. The lens gave a faint lick of light in gratitude. The rail on the gallery felt clean where gusts had leaned. A man can convince himself of many satisfactions up here. When I stepped back inside the watchroom, the hand lamp had made another delicate tide line of sand around its base. I lifted the lamp and the ring fell inward rather than outward, forming a tiny ridge as if the table had exhaled and decided to keep the light. I brushed it clean with the back of my wrist and told myself my cuffs were too generous. I do not believe men who call themselves tidy in a place made of salt. The inland echo taught me a new lesson near evening. When I rang the scheduled call and stood easy with the rope, the answer came not from the bowl behind the dune, but from the wreck field, a dry, bowed note, as if sand had laid a palm across the bronze and smiled at its own joke. I lowered the rope slowly, letting the fiber carry no message that I did not mean, and watched the fog where the ribs rise and fall. A seal head showed and vanished. The water there ahead of the bar wrinkled in an unhelpful way. Maps do not account for humor, and neither does my ledger. I wrote only that the answer had shifted laterally and that the cause was unknown. Because the desert seemed determined to take dictation, I gave it something harmless to write. I paced a square around the tower, treading firm lines in the sand, then smoothed one side with the heel of my boot and left the other sides crisp. I told myself I would look again in an hour, and if the smoothed side had been restored while the crisp lines remained, I would accept that the ground preferred regularity to mischief. When I returned near darkfall, the 3 crisp sides showed the slight feather a light breeze gives, nothing more. The smooth side, however, held a neat copy of my original edge, not a boot scrape, not a wind ruffle, a drawn line as tidy as a page border. I did not call it a message. I did say thank you, which is a habit I should break. As I set the lamp for night, the tower answered with the comfortable clicks and soft complaints of a body that knows its work. The lens took the first turn without a hitch. Down in the watchroom, I set the log slate where the hand would find it in the dark. The air scored the throat a little, sweet and wrong. I drank and found no change. I took the bell rope for the last call before full night and waited with an empty mind. The bell's voice went out clean. The late answer rose from inland and then from the wrecks, trading places like partners who had learned each other's steps. The interval between call and reply felt longer, though my chest kept to the same rhythm. A faint tapping reached me from the lee bowl, not stone, not shell. A soft pat, as of something learning to speak against its own confinement. I imagined a buried bell and corrected the thought. Imagination is costly here. I felt for the guy line without looking and found it steady. The dune held its bow. A small skitter crossed the path, paused at my boot and retreated, leaving a tiny groove that the wind did not claim. I wrote the night's summary before the dark could steal it. Inland echo variable, wreck field resonance joined, anchors secure, spatial drift within bowl continues, house steady, no hazard to navigation. I signed and let the chalk rest. The lines looked honest. They also looked like a man asking the desert not to trouble his sleep. A keeper is allowed to ask. He is not allowed to expect. I took off the oilskin and hung it on its peg. Sand whispered down inside the hem and pooled on the floor, more than I would expect after a day without real wind. I cupped the grit and poured it into my palm. It felt cool, with an odd smoothness, as if each grain had been handled of late, not tumbled. I threw it outside and listened. The tower breathed. The sea kept its old saw going. Somewhere inland, after a pause that decided itself, the dry bell spoke again without being invited. I did not answer. I let the interval stretch until it became a room I was willing to sit in. When I finally took the rope and gave the house its scheduled word, the bell's voice traveled well. I held the fiber, feeling for heat, and sensed only my own pulse smoothing out. The reply came late, but it came softer, as if someone were laying it gently on the sill. I thought about writing that, then did not. A man can flood his ledger with kindness and drown in it. I put the chalk down and turned the hand lamp low, leaving the watch to the tower and to the sand that had decided to keep notes. The light kept turning. The desert kept its appointment. Between them, I stood, on time, and listened. Morning arrived without edges. The fog did not thin so much as loosen its weave, and that small change let the tower feel larger than it is. I let the house tell me what came first. Glass, vents, burner, then the slow check of the winding that keeps the lens honest. The oilskin hung cold from its peg and held a breath of night in its seams. I put it on anyway because routine has a way of steadying the mind when the coast tries to teach other lessons. The hand lamp behaved, neither eager nor sullen. On the desk, the log slate waited like a shoreline that has never learned to lie. I wrote the seaplane and left it that way. Cold line holding, bait still inshore against its habits, raft dispersed and joined again as if a hand were counting and uncounting. I set the chalk down. There is a kind of writing that steadies a man and a kind that invites argument with himself. I try to keep to the first. When I took the bell rope, I paused because the fiber carried a warmth that did not belong to this room at this hour. I folded the rope across my palm and gave the bronze a workman call, not for moods, only for mariners. The tower spoke its honest word. The inland answer came late, dry as sifted flour. Then a faint second answer slid from the wreck field, thinner still, as if the ribs were learning a trick the dunes had taught. I decided to walk the path between tower and lee bowl before the fog could harden. The sand held the memory of my prints from last night in a way that felt like consideration, not chance. Each step I had set then lay a soft width from where my boot said it should have been, as if the ground had written a future for me and wished me to read it. I followed that offline track out of curiosity until it curved to the lip of the bowl and stopped dead at the shell cairn. My real stride arrived a moment later, catching up to the plan the dune had laid. The feeling was not pleasant. It was too much like being led in a house that should never lead. I spoke across the hollow with the neat phrase I had adopted for tests. Station awake, reply if able. The bowl gave me a silence that was not empty. Grains let go somewhere under the far lip, a small run like a cloth being folded. The inland bell answered late from behind my shoulder rather than from the bowl itself, as if it wished to avoid seeming obedient. I stepped down into the hollow for the first time since this began, setting my boots carefully along the weak curve a light wind had drawn. The air cooled by a finger's width with each pace inward. A pocket of night hung under day. A wrong smell lived there under the kelp and wool, a sweet note like damp rope stored with fruit. My plan was simple. I would cross the bowl and leave a clean, deliberate track, heel to toe, then return to the tower by a different line, keeping the set of the prints in mind the way a man keeps the order of a crank's teeth. Later, if the ground had made decisions without me, I would see it in the pattern. I started across. Halfway, the sand rose slightly under my left boot, then settled, not a slide but a lift from beneath, the way a breath moves under a blanket. I stopped and waited. The hum that lives under this place found my bones and stayed there in a thoughtful way that asked me to slow down. I obeyed because I am fond of walking out of rooms I entered whole. At the far lip, I looked back and saw my steps changed behind me. The spacing had tightened after the lift, as if I had shortened my stride to suit a slope that is not there. I had walked steady. The ground had written a correction. I took the shell cairn apart and rebuilt it with more care than it deserved. 2 shells bright side up, 1 dull side up, a private key. Then I returned along a new arc, slow, counting by breath because a body is the only measure that does not betray itself here. Near the crest, the handlamp flickered though its fuel was sound. I sheltered it with my palm and watched the flame lick and settle like a child deciding whether to cry. When I lowered the lamp, a neat ring of sand had climbed its base again, but this time the ring showed a break, a narrow gate on the side facing the tower. Back at the watchroom, the radio brought the southern keeper with a voice that sounded damp around the edges. He asked about my bell. I said it held steady. He asked whether the fog had charity or malice today. I said it had patience and an old idea of humor. He laughed the way men do when they agree to say nothing that would require an explanation later. Before he signed off, he said he had found tracks on the seaward side of his tower that matched his boot, but argued with his memory of walking. I pressed the key and then let it go without speaking, because comfort that cannot be defended is a poor gift. I made a short note on the slate and left space beside it as if it were waiting for a companion line I did not yet have courage to write. I tested the guys with a care that felt close to apology. The upwind anchor wore its thin shine in a new place, as though a careful hand had turned it exactly to ease strain I had not measured. The line hummed under my fingers when I leaned, the tone a little lower than yesterday, which would be expected if the dune had bowed further. It had. Not a slide, not a weakness, a deliberate courtesy as if the sand had decided to give the tower a friendlier angle on the wind that was not blowing. I set a small painted chip at the base of the shackle, tucked in where only I would see, a tiny witness to any further grace I had not requested. Near midday, the fog opened a window the width of a road. In that cut, the wreck field lay plain, ribs counting the tide. I watched a seal move between them with a stroke that favored silence. The water hung oddly around the hull plates, a small hesitation in the set, like an eddy that refuses to grow up. I rang a maintenance call and held the bell rope lightly while the bronze spoke. The echo returned from the wrecks first this time, then later from inland, reversing their learned order as if the two had debated and traded roles. I wrote that swapping on the slate and ached to call it by its feeling, which was more like courtesy than mechanics. The house began to write on me as I wrote on it. My hand on the rope settled into a grip I do not usually favor, thumb up the lay rather than across, and when I corrected myself, it took effort, like switching which foot goes first on a ladder a person has climbed for years. In the lantern room, I hesitated at the vent with new grit, waiting for a sound I did not need to hear to know whether the hinge had forgiven me for oiling it. When it offered a small, grateful click, I stood very still and let the feeling pass without making doctrine out of it. Below, the watchroom held a cool that I could not convince myself belonged entirely to the sea. The plan for evening was not more brave than yesterday, only more insistent. I would allow the house to show me the path it preferred and then choose against it once to find the price. I set the last daylight chores by habit, then took the hand lamp and stepped into the path of my own prints toward the lee bowl. Before my boot could land, the sand ahead showed a faint darkening where my soul would want to be. A pre-written step like a suggestion made by a polite host. I placed my foot alongside it instead, on clean sand. The darkened place stayed, neither insulted nor withdrawn. The next step offered itself again, a little farther to the right, toward the smoothest part of the lip. I refused and walked the rough line up the crest. When I reached the cairn, the shells had turned. Dull side up, bright in between, the pattern reversed neatly like a page folded and opened again. I lifted one shell and found a dry hollow beneath where the grain had settled as if a fingertip had tested it and been pleased. The late inland bell spoke behind me without the tower having called. I felt the sound in the ribs rather than in the ear, and it carried a kindness that bothered me more than any threat could. I set the shell back the way I had placed it earlier and stepped down into the bowl to find the track I had laid this morning. It had been rearranged with a precision I could not respect because I could not explain it. Heel and toe now fell in a cadence that matched mine after stair work, not the even stride I had used across level sand. The spacing accounted for my height, my leg, my unwillingness to stretch in fog, and yet it also smoothed my hesitations into a confidence I had not felt at the time. The bowl had made a better version of my walk and handed it back to me without pride. I left it undisturbed and returned to the tower because a man who lingers to admire his own improved steps in a place like this is a man who will miss the hour when the lamp needs him. Dusk stitched itself to the water without a seam. The lens took the turn well. I set the log slate at the edge of the desk and wrote the bare bones of the day. Inland, echo, and rec echo now trade order. Bowl writes path suggestions. Guy line angle assisted by dune, house steady, no hazard to navigation. Beneath that, I allowed one sentence of nonsense because I could not keep it out of my hand. Footsteps offered in advance, declined for now. I wiped the chalk dust across the line to soften it, and told myself I had not recorded a feeling so much as a physical fact. On the gallery, I took the bell rope for the night call. The fiber lay against my palm with the familiarity of old work. I rang the bell in the tone the service expects, the one taught to children who climb the tower on clear days and ask whether the world listens to such noises. The tower's voice went out clean and purposeful. I waited with my hands open. The Rex answered first, a thin bow of sound that felt like a salute from old bones. Then the inland bell came, later than comfort, and with a new thing in it, a faint rhythmic rub as of rope eased through a careful hand, the sound the bell rope makes when I prepare for a long weather call. It had borrowed my prelude. I kept still. The dune's lip shifted a small measure and then settled again. The guy line gave the tiniest pleased hum. On the desk inside, the hand lamp breathed and left a ring on the wood that was not round this time but oval, stretched along the axis that points from tower to bowl. I smoothed it with my cuff and did not tell the slate. I stood at the panel a while after schedule because I felt not watched but accompanied, and a keeper's oath has room for companionship only if he can define it. A soft pat came from the bowl, then another, like a hesitant foot trying a rung, letting weight gently onto a ladder that had not been counted. I put my hand flat on the rope and felt nothing but my own heat. Out in the rec field, water burred in the timbers with a patience I recognized from long winter watches. Between the three places, the tower, the ribs, the bowl, a path seemed to draw itself through the air, not a line one could see, only a promise a man could step into if he chose to be taught how to move. I didn't step. I set the bell rope back on its pin and let the tower hold its breath. The desert answered by holding its own. Then, after a pause long enough to make a person believe the world had gone still, the inland bell sounded once without help, late and gentle, a call I would have made if I had been kinder than I am. I could not say whether the sound belonged to mercy or to practice. I could say only that my next step, when I finally took it, felt written already a little way ahead of my boot. By first light, the house had taught me a new caution. The fog did not so much thin as grow seams, half-seen corridors opening and closing like a slow breath. I followed the routine as if reciting a creed. Glass first, a soft wipe along the prisms where midnight dew left a faint lattice. Vents next, the reluctant hinge now obedient under the small oil I had given it. Burner steady, mantle untroubled. I wound the mechanism until the resistance settled into that familiar weight which tells a lens it may rely on you. In the watchroom, my oilskin hung with a quiet drip at the hem from fog I could not swear I had walked through. I put it on anyway. The coat helps me listen. The slate wanted clean lines and I gave them. Cold water holding, bait still inside against scents, rafts scattered into small debating knots, shore break patient. I left a margin for later because the day looked like it wished to push back at any sentence I tried to finish. At the bell rope, I paused. Fiber met my palm with a warmth too human for this hour. I imagined some earlier keeper come to share the first call and push the thought away. The bronze spoke its workman tone and the tower's body received it like bread. I waited for the desert to choose its delay and felt the interval arrive not only in the ear, but in the ribs, a dry reply with a shape like mine. From the wrecks came a thinner echo, late to the meeting, then a small tap from the lee bowl as if someone touched a rung and withdrew. I chose method over mystery. I took the handlamp and walked the path to the dune by the route the ground had been offering these last days, letting the sand place each step half a boot's width off where I would normally land. The air in the hollow behind the crest held that wrong sweetness again, the hint of stored fruit in a rope locker that has never seen such cargo. The shell cairn had rotated itself back to my first order, bright on top, dull beneath. The change made so neatly that I could not claim wind for it unless I wanted to embarrass the wind. I stepped into the bowl, to where my improved tracks lay from yesterday, and found them polished by a careful heel, as if weight had been redistributed to flatter the stride. I knelt and pressed 2 fingers to the print. Cool waited there, and under the cool, a hum no longer shy. It filled the hand the way tide fills a notch in rock. The radio breathed at my hip, a small kindness, and brought the southern keeper in a voice that carried its own fog. He reported a fisherman's engine heard where no vessel should be in this weather, more hope than hazard, then asked whether my house had taken to offering steps in advance. I said that my sand had begun to write in a hand that resembled mine, and that I was choosing when to read. He answered that his tower had acquired a habit of recognizing his grip before he touched the rope, and then we both let the key rest because you must ration truth when it costs breath. Back at the tower, I set the morning checks again, as if I had not just finished them. It helped to put my attention in small corners. The lens base was dry in the spots where salt likes to condense. The gallery rail wore new grit on its seaward side, not from gust or spray, but laid in a short, neat strip at the place where a person would steady a hand before leaning out to read the sea. I wiped it with the cuff and rubbed the spot clean, then felt it with my palm for a whisper of warmth. It was ordinary metal, but my hand took a moment to believe me. By mid-morning, the fog stiffened and the sea grew quiet in a way that speaks of work happening beyond the audible. I rang a maintenance call, then set the rope on its pin and walked the base of the tower with the handlamp. On the leeward side, I found a new oval of sand at the threshold, stretched along the axis that runs from the door toward the bowl. The edges were higher than they should be, like a tiny berm built by a patient fingertip. I stepped over it and told myself I had stepped over nothing. In the watchroom, the slate waited, and I wrote the one sentence I could defend. Inland resonance consistent, wreck echo present, bowl continues to shape paths, anchors steady, light prepared. Beneath that, I added a fragment the service manual uses to quiet novices. The keeper keeps the schedule, the sea keeps the rest. I took the guy lines before noon. The upwind shackle had rotated a hair toward the angle I favor, as if a courteous helper had made a fine correction while I looked elsewhere. The line hummed in the same low way when I leaned, but the hum carried a second faint tone, an overtone I had not heard on this coast, like a chord played softly by 2 careful hands. I set the painted chip I had tucked against the metal and found it shifted a finger's width, not fallen, not scuffed, just relocated to sit more square to the tower. The dune's bow had deepened with restraint. It was not surrender but alignment. I decided on a stronger test and felt the cost of it while I made the plan. I would ring a long weather call, the kind made when fog refuses to learn its manners. Then I would walk the route the sand offered me exactly, boot to suggestion, and see whether the interval between our voices changed when I allowed the ground to lead. The service would not approve. The ledger would not hold my reasoning kindly. But a keeper must sometimes put body into the question he refuses to ask on paper. The bronze took the command well. The bell's voice went out solid and kind. I set the rope and stepped away into the ready-made path. The sand accepted my weight with the quiet of a practiced host. Each pre-written step matched my reach without forcing it. The bowl's air cooled by degrees a body knows even when the mind refuses to write numbers. When the inland reply arrived, it did not sound beside me or behind me, but within the space my chest had just vacated with a breath, as if the dune had waited for my lungs to open before it borrowed the room. I kept walking. The hum under the sand became a net cast softly upward through my bones, catching them in a pattern that asked for cooperation rather than obedience. At the cairn, the shells lay unchanged. That, more than anything, unsettled me. I spoke the dry phrase I had been using: station awake, reply if able. And the ground answered not with speech but with a slight tightening under the arch of my foot, the way a ladder rung stiffens when a second climber below has learned your rhythm and is taking weight just at the moment you lift. I stepped back toward the tower, and the sand offered an alternate line toward the wreck field, a gentle sweep along the dune's shoulder that I had never favored because it exposes a person to the wind even on a quiet day. The air there tasted sweeter, and for a heartbeat I thought of following it as a man thinks of turning toward music in a half-remembered street. I did not follow. I returned along the harder route and felt the house approve in the small way brass approves when it does not protest. As the day leaned toward evening, the fog drew tight again, showing the ribs and taking them away as if telling me to practice wanting. The radio cracked and failed to bring the southern keeper for a spell, then caught him in a threadbare line that carried only his breath and the words "routine holds." I sent back the same sentence, "the huh." At the slate, I wrote the bare bones and nothing extra. My hand shook a little, not from fear, from the particular fatigue that comes when a man has been polite to a landscape for longer than most friendships last. I set the lamp and let the lens begin its measured work. Down in the watchroom, I placed the handlamp on the desk and watched the sand ring form itself around the base with the same deliberation as before. Only now the break in the circle lay toward the door rather than toward the bowl, a neat gate that suggested an exit instead of an entrance. The bell rope brushed my sleeve without a draft to move it. I took that as my cue and went to the gallery for the night call. The bell's voice traveled with authority. The wreck echo returned first, a quick bow as if signaling that its part would be brief. Then the inland reply followed in the longer delay I had come to expect when I do not walk to meet it. The tone carried a small rasp exactly like the sound my rope makes when I change my grip to rest my wrist. A second after that, from somewhere between tower and bowl, a sound too soft to be metal lifted and fell, like a hand rehearsing a pull that it would not take. The guy line gave a contented whisper. The dune tightened its bow in one careful motion and then held. Between those places stretched an invisible corridor that felt wide enough to walk if I wished to let it define me. I went inside and faced the ledger because that is the price of keeping. I wrote, "Schedule maintained, echoes trading order, sand proposes routes, keeper declines when unsafe, anchors aided, house steady, no hazard to navigation." Then I put down the one sentence I could not avoid any longer. The bell now comes back with my own prelude borrowed by the land. I let the chalk sit and did not underline. Paper should not be made to carry a man's shaking. When I hung the oilskin, more sand dropped out than sense would allow. It glittered along the floorboards in a line pointing toward the door, each grain seeming to choose its place, rather than tumble into it. I cupped them and poured them outside. The air tasted of kelp and something like wet rope that has not yet seen daylight. I stood a long while with my palm on the rope, not ringing, only learning the temperature of my own patience. The late inland bell answered anyway, a single gentle tone set carefully in the fog, the kind of sound I would have made if I had chosen companionship over caution. I kept my silence, and the tower kept turning its light across a sea that had decided to keep its secrets in plain hearing. Toward full night, the corridor between Rex and Bowl did not vanish as corridors of air normally do. It grew steadier, a felt thing rather than a seen thing, a lane of agreement drawn through weather and sand. The steps it offered were neat, narrow, and efficient, a better version of me pressed into the ground ahead of my own boots. I stood with the bell rope in hand and understood that the next part of this watch would ask a keeper to decide which order he serves when two kinds of steadiness meet in fog and agree to be kind. I gave the bell its last scheduled word, and when the late reply rose from the sand, I looked at the corridor and did not move. The day began with a hush that argued for care. Fog pressed low, thicker than wool, and the cold breath of the upwelling crept through seams the oilskin could not fully deny. I let the house decide the order. Glass first, a patient wipe that found a faint film of salt in places that should have been clean. Vents next, their shy clicks like small agreements. Burner even, mantle steady, clockwork wound until the resistance settled into that familiar trust that says the lens can lean on you. I told my hands to be dull. Dull hands make honest work. On the slate, I wrote the seaplane, cold line stable, bait oddly inside, raft broken and forever reconsidering itself. I left space for what the land might argue. At the rope I paused. Fiber carried a warmth that belonged to a companion who had just stepped aside. I let the bell speak in its workman tone and stood still as a mark on a chart. The tower's voice traveled. The Rex answered first with a thin bow. The dune answered after, late and dry, then followed with a soft rasp, like my own rope being paid out with care. Between those sounds lay a corridor wide enough to tempt a duty-bound man. The radio found me before I could be found by my own thoughts. The southern keeper spoke in a low voice that left no room for bravado. He said a fishing skiff had missed a check and that there was talk of a drift toward our stretch. He had no visibility past his wall of gray. He asked whether my bell threw clean and whether my water showed any fresh engine cut into the weave. I answered with the truth I could defend, light prepared, bell reliable, surface quiet in a way that reads like work just past seeing. I didn't mention that the land had begun to learn my prelude. He signed off with a promise to hail at last light. I set the radio down with more care than it deserved. Decision likes to pretend it is a visitor. It is a resident here. I took the hand lamp and walked the path the sand offered, letting the pre-written steps place themselves just a breath off my habit. The bowl behind the dune held its pocket of night, cool and sweet in that wrong way, like rope stored beside fruit. The shells on the cairn had not moved, and that steadied nothing. I stepped into the hollow and felt the familiar hum rise through bone. It did not press. It suggested. That is worse. Suggestions make a man grateful even when he should be strict. I wanted to test the corridor on my terms. The plan was simple and costly. I would ring a fog call, longer than courtesy. A C-mark ride kept just this side of excess. Then walk the offered line toward the wreck field until the interval between tower and dune closed to the smallest possible space a person can still call delay. If the corridor shortened the distance by teaching me its steps, I would know. The service would not like such an experiment. But the ledger does not row a skiff home. A keeper must learn what the chart refuses. I set the rope, breathed, and began the bell's long work. Bronze spoke with the patience of bread shared. I moved into the corridor. The sand accepted my weight like a taught apprentice ready to hand up the next tool. Each step placed itself a little forward of my habit, narrower, more efficient, a better me uploaded to the ground. The inland reply rose not from behind but just to one side, nearly synchronous with my breath leaving my chest, as if the dune had learned the clock in my ribs. I walked until the hum underfoot became a soft net, catching my bones in a pattern that asked for kindness and steadiness, and I gave both, because kindness and steadiness are what keepers own when seas want more than light. At the shoulder above the wreck field, the fog thinned to gauze. The ribs showed and vanished. Water there held a faint hesitation, a pause like a thought on a tongue. I stopped. The corridor did not stop. It extended out over the shoal in a suggestion of footing that had no right to exist. Not a path a man can see, a pressure of intention through air and spray, the sense that if I placed another step it would find its rung. I did not. I'm fond of living. I turned back toward the bowl, and the sand stayed kind even to refusal. Back at the tower, the guy line sang low when I checked it, and in the song I heard a second thin companion tone, like two careful hands on the same rope. The painted chip I had tucked by the shackle had edged itself squarer still, seated as if it had always belonged. The dune's bow deepened one more shade of will without sliding. I touched the shackle and set my jaw against a feeling I did not trust, the feeling that the land and I were working a shared job. Shared jobs are dangerous. They ask for gratitude that cannot be reconciled with orders. Near midday, the fog pressed harder. Sound came short, then long, the way it does when weather forgets what material it is made from. The radio broke the hush with a voice I did not know well, a coastal relay. It reported a flare rumored far to the north, unconfirmed, and asked if my sector had any color on the water or smoke in the fog. I said, no smoke, no flame, no wake, nothing but a sea going about work that keeps its sleeves rolled past the elbows. I promised to ring to schedule and to keep the light turning heavy when day thinned. Then I set the radio down and stood with the rope in my hand while my better self argued with my curious self. I chose the better self. I kept to schedule. Between calls, I walked the base, then the gallery, then the base again. On the desk, the hand lamp formed its tidy sand ring with the little gate cut toward the door, welcoming rather than inviting in. I smoothed it away and watched as a few late grains slid from the lamp's base to restore the break, making a small doorway in dust that pointed to the corridor. I left it. A man can smudge a sign only so many times before the sign teaches him that his palms are not the master. By late afternoon, the Southern keeper's voice returned, thin but intact. He had nothing new on the missing skiff, only an assurance that other stations were listening, other lights doing their good work. He asked as if he were asking about whether my ground had taken to writing steps in advance. I said yes, and that I was stepping beside them when I could. He said his house had begun to ease his hand toward the rope at the right moments without touching him. We both waited with the key open and said nothing further. Then we signed off because men cannot confess what they cannot defend. Evening set its wet wool on the tower shoulders. I wound the mechanism and felt the gears answer with an even temper. In the lantern room, the prisms took the first turns and threw shy glints on brass. Down in the watchroom, I laid the slate where the hand remembers to find it. I wrote only what the service will keep. Echoes persist. Corridor effect suspected. Anchors stable. Routine maintained. No hazard to navigation observed. I left out what my bones had learned because bones do not sit for interviews. For the night call, I stepped onto the gallery with the oilskin still holding the last cold it had gathered and took the rope as one takes a vow. I rang the bell and stood with my hands open. The wrecks bowed back. The inland bell came late in the shape of my own habit. Then, from the corridor itself, a small, almost sound lifted. Not metal, not wind. More like the throat of air opening in advance of speech. The guy line murmured. The dune held its bow. The tower kept its breath even and measured. I did a thing the manual would forgive only if it worked. I gave the bell a second call a shade early, just ahead of schedule, as if caught by weather rather than choice. The corridor answered almost on top of the tower's word, the delay shaved thin as a blade. For a handful of breaths, I felt as if the land and I were ringing together, a single instrument with parts in sand and brass. In that joint sound lived a simple invitation. Let the root choose you, only for a while, only until the sea gives up what it hides. I did not accept. I set the rope on its pin and stepped back into the room. The hand lamp's gate in sand had widened, a neat oval opening toward the door as if for a boot I had not yet decided to lift. I brushed it closed and it opened again by itself, a few grains walking outward without breeze. I stood until the need to move arrived as a practical matter rather than a temptation. Then I walked the base once more and found, at the threshold of the lee path, my prints laid ahead of me to the first bend, neat, narrow, efficient. The corridor had advanced its promise. It no longer waited for me to begin. I returned to the desk and faced the slate because a keeper must be witnessed by something, even when he will not tell the whole truth. I wrote, "Schedule kept. Corridor now anticipates. House steady." I signed and set the chalk down. Outside, after a pause long enough for a man to decide that nothing would happen, the inland bell spoke once on its own, the same note I would have chosen if I had changed my mind. The tower did not answer. Neither did I. The light kept turning, and the night arranged itself around a path that led from wrecks to bowl and brushed past my door with patient certainty. I stood precisely where duty sets a person and understood that the next movement would not be mine alone. The hush had the feel of work beginning out of sight. Fog pressed to the stones and the cold breath from the water moved along the floorboards as if the house had learned to draw air from the sea. I set my hands to dull tasks because dull tasks keep a keeper honest when choices try to arrive wearing kindness. Glass first, a patient wipe in patient circles. Vents next, each hinge given its quiet touch so it would not invent troubles later. Burner steady, mantle willing. Clockwork wound until the weight settled into the palm with that known promise that says the lens will not desert you when the night asks its usual questions. I put on the oilskin, not because I was cold, but because it is easier to think in cloth that has learned your shape. The slate wanted lines, and I gave them without embroidery. Cold line steady, bait still inside, raft scattered yet alert, shore break patient. I left a margin because margins admit that a day may claim space from any plan. At the bell rope, I paused with a small superstition and let the fiber rest across my palm until it stopped pretending to be only rope. Heat lingered that did not belong to this room. I rang the house voice in the tone the service expects, the tone meant for mariners and not for moods. The tower spoke. From the wrecks came the lean bow I now recognized as greeting. From inland, the dry answer rose with its familiar delay and borrowed my prelude. Between those voices, the corridor held itself ready, a pressure through the fog that felt like a walkway laid by patience. The radio broke in with more breath than words. The Southern Keeper, thin and careful. A rumor of a skiff seen or not seen, a flare reported and then denied by a man who mistrusted his own eyes. He asked what my water said. I told him the surface wore a quiet that reads like someone working behind a curtain. I added that my bell would keep to schedule and my light would carry hard after day gave up. He said only, "Keep your ledger straight." We signed off without comfort because comfort cannot be audited later. I walked the base to feel the tower beside me. Sand had drawn an oval at the threshold with its neat little gate cut toward the door, a door within a door. The handlamp's base wore its usual ring, broken now in two places like a lane crossed by a lane. I let the pattern stand and took the path the ground had been drafting for me these last watches. Pre-written steps lay a half boot off my habit, narrow and efficient. The dune's lip held its bow with a rehearsed grace. In the bowl, the air was cool the way a cellar keeps cool against argument. Under that air lived the wrong sweetness, not strong, just certain, a rope and fruit echo that refused a name. I crossed the hollow slowly and spoke the phrase I had used for tests, a boring sentence a person might say to a silent line. Station awake, reply if able. The sand answered with its hum through bone, not louder, not braver, only closer to the shape of my breath. I set a shell upright on the cairn and left the other lying on its back, a private code, then stood still long enough for the bowl to decide whether it cared to read. Nothing moved that the eye could certify. The ground simply lacked the temptation to pretend emptiness. That was worse than movement. Back at the guys, I felt for trouble like a mechanic counting teeth in a gear. The upwind shackle had settled into a truer square, my painted chip tucked more honest than any hand would dare without leaving a scuff. When I leaned, the line sang a low tone, and under it a second one joined, tight and helpful, as if a careful apprentice had matched my pull and then withdrawn before I could name the help. I pushed away and let the dune keep its courtesy. A man can say thank you only so many times before the word costs him in other accounts. Midday brought a pocket of thinner fog that drew a pale lane from bowl to wrecks and closed it again like a mouth swallowing a thought. I tested the corridor the way a keeper tests his own fear, not by denial, but by procedure. A long weather call first, only a shade beyond courtesy, then the rope set on its pin, then the walk at a measured breath. The sand accepted me with practiced hospitality. The inland answer rose almost on top of the tower's voice, delay shaved thin, like breath shared. Out by the ribs, the water held that hesitation I had been watching all week, a pause that looks like a gate held for someone who has not yet arrived. I didn't step onto air. I'm stubborn in ways the sea respects. I turned and returned along the offered line, refusing to decide with my feet what I had not finished deciding with my head. At the threshold, the oval of sand had widened its gate toward the door by a little flourish, a flourish I would never make with a broom. Inside, the handlamp breathed once and the grain slid from its base to lay a second small doorway pointing toward the corridor. I wiped it smooth with the back of my sleeve. It drew itself again, slower, as if a careful hand remembered my caution and tried to honor it. The radio found me near late afternoon, voice thin as wire, a relay from farther north. An unconfirmed shape heard in the fog, the sound of an engine starting, then quitting. No sighting to tie it to, only a feel on the water the way a skiff announces itself without meaning to. I looked at the slate and at the rope and at the oval of sand opening toward the door, and understood I was being asked for the kind of decision that steals sleep, even when it saves lives. The manual offers sentences for such hours. None of them mention corridors carried by dunes. I set the chores as if the day were ordinary, because that is how you carve a path through an hour that is not. Lamp ready. Mechanism wound. Lens checked. Gallery walked. I placed the slate where the hand knows to reach even in blackness. Then I stood at the rope and let my better self argue with my curious self, until both were tired enough to be useful. When I pulled, I made the bell speak clean and full, a house word meant to be heard past doubt. The wrecks bowed back. The inland voice came late and careful. Between them, the corridor lifted like a held breath. I did a thing the service would not praise and would not punish if it worked. I gave the bell a call, a breath before schedule. The corridor answered inside the same breath with my own prelude wearing a coat of sand. For a handful of heartbeats, it felt as if the land and I were partners in an old craft. Then I turned away from that feeling, set the rope on its pin, and took the handlamp to the threshold. The oval gate lay open. I stood with one boot inside the line and one boot out and listened harder than I have ever listened to anything that did not carry a human voice. From far north, thin through the gray, came the cough of a small engine trying to catch and failing. Not much, enough to tilt a life. I took my foot off the painted floorboards and onto the sand, into the path that had been written. The ground adjusted my stride by a polite fraction I would never have granted to any other teacher. I moved along the shoulder where the dune listens and felt the hum lift through bone like a web raising a net. The bowl kept its cool. The wrecks breathed. The corridor shaped my steps, not forceful, only exact. Each placement carried a little of the bell's tone, as if walking had learned to ring. At the shoulder above the ribs, the fog parted in a lip that offered a small distance and then swallowed it again. I stopped where a man stops who respects edges and placed the handlamp on the sand, letting its light make a low, steady promise. I spoke, not into air, but into routine. Station, awake, light steady. Bell, ready. The tower answered from behind without being asked, a single stroke, the kind a house makes when a keeper lifts a rope he does not know he has lifted. The guy line murmured approval. The dune eased its bow and held. I could have stepped farther. The corridor said so. It said it with a kindness that felt like consent written ahead of action. I let that consent pass me like weather through a screen and chose the work I know. I returned to the rope, waited for schedule, and rang the house word the way it has been rung longer than any of us have kept count. The wrecks answered late with a gentler bow. Inland, the sand replied, late still, but with a new timbre that reminded me of an engine learning how to run, a drag becoming a smooth turn. I held the rope and did not look toward that sound because there are kinds of hope that demand more proof than a man can carry alone. On the slate I wrote the portion the service can keep, schedule maintained, corridor effect present, assistance rendered by light and sound, anchors steady, house steady, no hazard to navigation beyond ordinary fog. I signed in the tight hand I use when I would rather not see my name at the bottom of the page. I left unfinished room, the width of a line, for the sentence I wanted and could not write. Full night took the edges. The lens ran as if it had been born turning. The bell spoke its set words. The corridor held its soft invitation. From the north, now and again, the faintest breath of an engine came and went, not nearer, not farther, only deciding in its own time. I stood on the gallery with the rope across my palm and felt the fiber grow warm, the way a hand grows warm when work finds it. Below, at the threshold, the oval of sand kept its little gate open. In the bowl, the shells lay exactly as I left them. Out by the ribs, water hesitated as if holding a place. I do not know whether the skiff chose my lane. I know only that the house and the sand and the wrecks had learned each other's voices well enough to make a path a person could feel without seeing. I kept the light turning and the bell speaking until my arms said stop, then kept going long enough to be certain I would not call myself timid in the morning. When I finally set the rope on its pin and reached for the slate, the handlamp laid a thin ring around its base once more and left a neat break aimed toward the door. I smoothed it. It drew itself again, slowly, patient as tide. The fog breathed against the glass. The tower breathed back. Far inland, late as ever and kind as it has become, the sand gave a single, careful bell in the note I would have chosen if I had stepped farther than I did. I stood with my palm on the fiber and let the interval stretch until it felt less like a demand and more like a room a man can inhabit. The light kept turning. On the path between wrecks and bowl, where the fog carries truth at its own pace, a set of neat, narrow steps wrote themselves a little way ahead of my boots and waited without hurry for whomever they would fit.